Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing. Really appreciate you guys checking today's video out and spending some time with me. Guys, today we're going to be talking about wintertime jig fishing. I want to give you guys some tips and advice on catching bass in cold water months, really from about November to early March. The techniques and the approaches I'm going to talk about in today's video will work for you guys, so we're going to get into that in today's episode. Also, guys, a couple quick housekeeping tips before we get started here. I just want to invite anybody that is interested in booking an on-the-water lesson with me just to shoot me a private message on my Facebook page, Randy Blaukat Professional Angler. We're doing a lot of jerkbait trips right now on Table Rock and Stockton Lake, so I can give you all the information for that. And also, guys, we are just about 40 to 50 people short of reaching 10,000 subscribers here on Advanced Bass Fishing. So big thank yous for the people that have subscribed, and I'd like to invite everybody to hit that subscribe button, help us push over that 10,000 mark. Really appreciate that. Okay, now you guys know, a lot of you guys that follow my other channels, you know that I'm really big jig fisherman. Jig and jerk baits are my two biggest things. And before I get started, I want to pump my jig line here a little bit because we're going to be talking about this, guys. This is my Blaukat my Blaukat Throwback jig by Cumberland Pro Lures. These are living rubber jigs, guys, hand tied with living rubber. So I'll link my Tackle Warehouse link in the description to my Blaukat Throwback jig link, so if you guys would like to pick some up. But one of the things I want to talk about here, guys, is before we get into it, is the design of a jig, especially in the wintertime, is really important. And I want to sort of go over a little bit here about why a jig component design is important. First of all, the living rubber, guys. The living rubber is a lot more lifelike in the winter time of the year, a lot more lifelike than silicone. It just sort of vibrates. And another thing about the living rubber is it puts out a unique glow in the water that silicone simply doesn't do. And it's just my favorite jig material. On top of that, my Throwback jig's got a hand-tied skirt, which flares the skirt a little bit more and makes it more natural. And then you got a short shank hook on it, which also gives it a better, smaller profile. The hook eye on it is turned at an angle, so it'll come over limbs and brush really good. And it's got this powder coated paint on the head here. You can't hardly ship this even if you throw it on the concrete. So quick plug there. Like I said, I'll link that jig link in the description of the video. Okay, now jig fishing in the winter time of the year is different than fishing in other times of the year. Now it's different in the sense of your setup for it, the colors, how you work it, and the type of areas you fish it in. First of all, let's talk specifically about the jig setup. In the winter time, I like to trim my jigs down, and that's what I've done with this one here, guys. I've cut the skirt probably about half, and I put a small trailer on it. This is a Zoom Super Chunk Junior. Most of the time in the other time of the year, I don't cut the skirt down much, and I put a larger trailer on it. But for the winter time, you're going to get a lot more bites by downsizing it. So this is, you can see, it's a really little edible looking tidbit here. You want to downsize your profile. Short skirt, short trailer, make it nice and compact. You're going to get a lot more bites with it. Second with that, in the winter time of the year, color is critical. And I don't know what it is. I think it has to do with something about the water tint and the water clarity. But brown is the key color. Brown, sometimes I'll use brown and orange. We make both brown and orange in the Throwback jig, but stay with brown. Brown is going to be your key cold water color, matched up with some type of a green pumpkin or a watermelon trailer. Now, this is critical right here. Every single month of the year almost, they prefer a different color jig. And if you've seen some of my other videos on my other channels, I've talked about different colors at different months, and a lot of it has to do with a couple different factors. It has to do with the fish are feeding on, it has to do with the water clarity and the water tint. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about water clarity and water tint. In the winter time of the year, the water is usually lower and it's clearer than any other time of the year. You don't have as much algae and plankton in the water to make it green. So most of the time in the winter time, your water is cleaner than it is in any other time of the year. And the tint of the water is different. In other words, in the summertime of the year, if you sort of have like a green looking tint to the water from the algae and plankton, in the winter time of the year, that's not as prevalent, and your water gets a little bit more on the aqua blue side for the most part. And the combination of that cleaner water and the different tint makes these fish really want a brown jig with a green trailer. This is super, super key, your color on it. That color, guys, is probably, when you're jig fishing, in the winter time of the year, because most of the time what I'm going to be talking about today is water visibilities over 3 feet where you're going to fish this in the winter. It makes all the difference in the world. You can throw, 20 different colors of jigs and you won't get near the bites that you will on a solid brown jig with a green trailer. So remember that. The next thing with it is you need to downsize your line a little bit. Jig fishing, for the most part, I like to use heavy line because I usually fish it around thicker cover, but in the winter time, I'm not fishing my jig around thicker cover. I'm fishing it on sparser cover and rock primarily. So for the most part, I'm going to be using 15-pound test Seagar Invisex fluorocarbon line and a 1/2 ounce jig, maybe a 3/8 depending upon the depth that I'm fishing, but a 3/8 to 1/2 ounce is probably my favorite colors with that. 1/2 ounce if I'm fishing a little deeper, 3/8 if I'm fishing like less than 10 feet deep. And most of the time, even in the winter time, I do fish it on a flipping stick. Now, the way that you work the jig is a little bit different too in the winter time of the year, because a lot of you guys that have seen my other channel, I talk about what's called the big fish hop on a jig, where I'll make the cast with the jig and I hop it pretty hard, pop the rod tip hard like that. But in the winter time, I don't do that. I'll cast it out there, let it hit the bottom, and I'm just sort of shaking it. I'm shaking the rod tip and pulling it up a little bit. So I'm not really hopping it off the bottom. I'm just sort of shaking it, almost like you'd work a shaky head. Just see how my rod's just sort of shaking and I'm pulling at the same time? Take up the slack, shake it like that a little bit, keep that jig in contact with the bottom. So in that colder water, instead of doing this hop that you do normally on jig fishing, I'm just sort of scooting it along the bottom, maybe short hops like that. But I don't want to hop the jig no more than 4 or 5 inches off the bottom. I want to try to I don't want to drag it like a football head jig. I want to shake it and keep it hopping a little bit, but I want to keep it close to the bottom and keep the movement to a minimum. You're going to get a lot more strikes with that. Now, the areas that you fish a jig in the wintertime is also critical, because when I'm talking about wintertime jig fishing, I'm talking about when your water temperature on the lake that you're fishing is at its coldest point or within maybe 5 degrees of that. And that's normally, again, between December and February. Wintertime jig fishing to me is when that water temperature is between the low 40s to the low 50s. That's going to cover most of the water temperatures around the country here. But if you gave me an ideal jig fishing water temperature for wintertime fishing, I'd say 45 to 50 degrees would be perfect, in my opinion there. It seems like that's what they really get on it. Now, what you want to look for on wintertime jig fishing is you need to look for vertical rock structures. So that being said, depending upon the lake that you fish, it could be a variety of different things. Bluff banks are probably my favorite. Some type of a main lake or creek channel bluff bank. Doesn't have to be a vertical wall, but just a steep, bluffy bank, can have rock transitions. It can even have, steep rock bank, like a 45 to 60 degree angle bank that drops off into deeper water, or sharp riprap. Riprap is a great place to fish a jig in the winter time of the year if you have deep water on it. But you want some type of a rock structure that has a fairly sharp slope on it. This is crawdads live in those type of rocks. This is just where the jig excels. You don't want to fish flat areas. I don't do that good fishing around docks or around wood. It's pretty much just rock structures. Now, if you have a lake that doesn't have a lot of rock, which most lakes do, you can do the same thing on like pea gravelly type banks or even clay banks that have deep water up against it, because some of the lakes that don't have a lot of rock, they can have some gravelly type banks and they got water falling right off of it. You can do the same thing on that. But given my rathers, I would rather have some type of a bluffy bank. And most any man-made impoundment, guys, has a bluff bank. Almost any single man-made impoundment, you can do that with it. And even if you guys fish grass lakes, I mean, you're talking more about fish being on ledges or on the outside of the grass, but for the most part, this is going to be for man-made impoundments, with a little bit cleaner water. And another thing with it, I have found out about jig fishing, it's usually better in the wintertime if your lake has some type of a mix of largemouth and spotted bass. Smallmouth too, but if it's got a decent spotted bass population, it even makes it a better jig lake with that. Another thing, guys, is like all you guys that fish Alabama, those Coosa River lakes, this is a great setup for fishing up in the river and the current on those, undercut banks and you know, all that stuff up in the moving water of the rivers. But anyway, guys, good bait for the winter time. Like I said, most of the fishing that I do in the winter time, I probably fish a jerk bait more than anything. You know, followed up by a jig, followed up maybe by a little swim bait, something like that. But a jig will catch you a good fish, and there's not a single month out of the year they don't work. So hope it helps out. We'll talk later.